Hello, welcome to the Ukrainian Studies organization at Indiana University. I'm Natalia Shpilova-Said and Ania Bramian is joining me today. Our speaker is Dr. Serhy Yekelchyk, Professor of Slavic Studies and History at the University of Victoria, Canada. And the title of his talk is Transforming Kyiv's Memorial Space. Today's lecture is hosted by Dr. Emily Channell-Justice. She's the director of the Temerty Contemporary Ukraine Program at the Ukrainian Research Institute, Harvard University. She is a sociocultural anthropologist who has been doing research in Ukraine since 2012. She has pursued research on political activism and social movements among students and feminists during the 2013-2014 Euromaidan mobilizations. Her ethnography without the state, self-organization and political activism in Ukraine is in progress, and her edited volume, Decolonizing Queer Experience, LGBT Narratives from Eastern Europe and Eurasia, will be out later this year from Lexington Books. She has published academic articles in several journals, including History and Anthropology, Revolutionary Russia, and Science, Journal of Women in Culture and Society. She received her PhD from the Graduate Center, City University of New York in September 2016, and she was a Havinghurst Fellow and visiting Assistant Professor of International Studies at Miami University, Ohio from 2016 and 2019. We will start with Dr. Yekelchyk's lecture. Please submit your comments and questions via the Q&A option, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. All questions and comments will be addressed during our discussion. At this point, I'll turn the floor to Emily. Thank you so much for moderating our lecture today, Emily.
Thank you so much, Natalia and Ani, and thank you to the whole Ukrainian Studies organization at Indiana. You've put together just a really excellent series of lectures in all of Ukrainian studies, which I think is a real feat. I'm really pleased to get to be part of this conversation with Dr. Yekelchyk, who I think is one of the preeminent historians of Ukraine and whose work spans many essential topics, including the one that we're talking about today. In addition to being Professor of Slavic Studies at University of Victoria, he's also the current president of the Canadian Association for Ukrainian Studies, and he is the author of 7 books on modern history in Ukraine and Ukrainian-Russian relations, including the award-winning Stalin Citizens, Everyday Politics in the Wake of Total War, which came out in 2015, and a brief introduction to the current war with Russia, Ukraine. It's entitled Ukraine, What Everyone Needs to Know. The second edition was released in 2020, and I will just say really briefly here, I think this is the book that I have recommended people to read most since 2014. If you haven't read it and you're listening now, go pick it up. It's brief, it's concise, and the information is really essential. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your take on this important issue of the transformation of memorial spaces in Ukraine since independence. So thank you, Dr. Yekelchyk, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for a wonderful introduction, Emily. It's a pleasure to be given a talk in this series. I would like to thank the Indiana Ukrainian Studies organization, Natalia, Ani, and everybody involved for doing such a great job coordinating presentations from scholars around the world. And it's actually a lot of presentations that I would like to attend in this program. Not enough hours in the day to attend all the presentations these days, but the program is superb and an important new addition to the global network of Ukrainian studies. Today I'm going to talk about the project which I never really seriously pursued. It just so happened that as I was visiting Ukraine over the years for research purposes and spending time with my parents, I was forced to pay attention to certain changes in memorial landscape. I always thought that I was a historian of Stalinism and perhaps also doing work now on both world wars and a little bit on the Ukrainian Revolution. But it was almost, I was drawn into the controversies over the memorial landscape, the Victory Day, and the monuments in parts of Ukraine where the memory politics was most contested. It also so happened that my parents' apartment in Kyiv is located very close to several landmarks which were involved in these controversies. So it was even difficult for me to get back home from the archive and my work on Stalinism or World War I and the revolution without noticing the rallies at certain monuments or the changes that were taking place with these monuments themselves. I always thought it would be a small project, perhaps an article or two, and by now it can already be a small book in Ukrainian, which I think is what is going to come out of it, because Ukrainian audience is the most important one for a topic like that. They are the ones going through these transformations, and it would probably resonate there as well. But there will be articles in English too. And so in today's talk, I'm going to combine some articles already published or in the process of being considered with the ones to be written as yet at some future date. And I would like to start the discussion of how Kyiv's memorial space is being transformed with some images. I'm sure that many of you in the audience are going to be familiar with Kyiv's main monuments, but we will try today to take a fresh look at them. And some of them actually do look different now than they were previously. So if I try here sharing screen, and that would bring me to my presentation. Okay, so let's take a look at the first two images. The one on the left would be very familiar to Western audiences. This is the image from early 2014 when Lenin's statue was toppled in the center of Kyiv. A very spectacular event, the event in which all the mainstream Western media reported. Many of us, the historians of Ukraine and political scientists working on the country, ended up providing commentary for the Western media. It is a spectacular event, but the thing is, I don't think too many Western viewers occupied themselves with the question what Lenin's statue was in fact doing in Kyiv, Ukraine in 2014, given that it has been almost 25 years since the collapse of communism. And in what way Lenin's statue was then connected to the ongoing revolution and the war with Russia, which was about to start, but which had been a reality for some time already in terms of propaganda. And that actually brings me to an important point. Lenin's monument had some symbolic plasticity. It's quite difficult for us to think of a monument to a major Soviet political figure as a monument which can be reimagined, but it was. Because those protecting Lenin monuments in Ukraine were not necessarily communists. Those destroying them were not necessarily fighting against communism, but rather against something more important and more relevant to them. The Soviet legacy was embodied in these monuments, and more specifically in present-day political landscape, friendship with Russia, close relations with Russia. So during the decades after the fall of communism, Lenin statues and some other monuments as well became reimagined as standing for the Soviet past and for the neighboring country, which was making a point of protecting and propagandizing this Soviet past. Therefore, now we have the concept of symbolic plasticity, which is going to be important in this presentation. It's not the only one we are going to introduce. Now, let's take a look at another monument in this image. That's also a very familiar one, the equestrian statue of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, constructed in Kyiv in 1888. What do we see here? That's the monument with almost universal plasticity in the Ukrainian case. It satisfied the vision of Imperial Russian government. It was satisfactory also for the Ukrainophiles, the kind of more legalistic brand, loyalist brand of Ukrainian patriots in the 19th century. It worked during the revolution. the only thing that were needed during the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917-1921 were actually attaching the blue and yellow national flag to the hetman's mace and removing 2 letters from the inscription, because the inscription read, to Bogdan Khmelnytsky, Russia, one and indivisible. So in Nedelima was removed, and then the monument was acceptable to an entirely new political regime. Likewise, for the Soviet authorities, it was also acceptable, except for a very brief period in the 1920s, as a monument of the Ukrainian-Russian friendship, the historical relationship allegedly marked by the guidance of the elder Russian brother. So all kinds of versions of history could be projected upon this statue. And it could stand, and now stands actually for something else completely. It now stands for the idea of independent Ukraine, interestingly enough. The meaning which was invested in statue during the Ukrainian Revolution, and more recently when the Ukrainian authorities decided to move the center of celebrations in the capital from the Maidan, for a variety of reasons, which I wouldn't go into, to St. Sophia Square. And St. Sophia was also the place already marked as a celebration space in the time of the Ukrainian Revolution. Here's another interesting difference between these 2 monuments. The Bogdan Khmelnytsky monument is very well anchored in a historical landscape. It is connected to the notion of religion and tradition. It stands in the approximate place where Bogdan Khmelnytsky actually entered Kyiv in 1648. It is also right across from the main entrance to St. Sophia Cathedral. And so it is actually connected to Ukrainian history in a variety of ways. It is, therefore, stronger as a symbolic marker of this space. Even so, we can reimagine it in a variety of ways, and in the Soviet imagination, St. Sophia would, of course, only function as a museum and a place where Bogdan Khmelnytsky entered Kyiv. During the Ukrainian Revolution, there would actually be religious processions coming out from Sophia and joining the celebrations. But what about Lenin, you could ask? Is Lenin anchored in historical landscape? No, not necessarily. Lenin never visited Kyiv. There is no special connection between his political trajectory as a revolutionary and the actual location of Kyiv, Ukraine. Lenin, of course, had very particular views on Ukraine, on conquering Ukraine and exploiting Ukraine. But that particular location for the statue doesn't tell us much. So why is it there? If we go back in history, we would discover actually that during the post-war period, the parades on Khreshchatyk Avenue were going in a different direction. So instead of the current direction to the European square, they actually went in the opposite one. And that lasted until 1976. So if they proceed in the opposite direction from the European square to Bessarabka, then Lenin would be standing on the right with his hand towards the marchers, as if greeting the crowd. And that was the actual reason why it was constructed then and there. It actually was built into the social practice, which is also a political and cultural practice at the same time, of Soviet celebrations. It made sense back then. So it's not a historical anchoring then, but it is an anchoring in ceremonial culture, which also makes monuments powerful or better targets. Now, what is a Soviet monument, however, you would ask? And with a good reason. Not all the Soviet monuments were attacked with hammers in Ukraine. There are perfect Soviet monuments which perfectly fit the ideological prescriptions of the time that are still much revered by Kyivans and Ukrainians in general. Now, the monument to Shevchenko is actually a very good example to illustrate my point about the practices of commemoration. It is a Stalinist monument, very much so. There is nothing about the artistic representation that would attract a person of the 21st century to it. However, there is a prehistory of imagining this place differently. The Ukrainian dissidents in the 1960s met at the monument for the anniversary of Shevchenko's reburial in Ukraine, when his body was brought from St. Petersburg to Ukraine. And this place was constantly monitored by the KGB, who were photographing students from the university. I was a student at the university in the late 1980s. And back then, everybody knew that if you go there, you will be on the film. You will be on film. So the monument can be aesthetically very Stalinist, very socialist realist, and with the best intentions of the authorities at the time of the day, but reimagined with new social practices, as Shevchenko most certainly was. Now, the monument to the founders of the city of Kyiv, that's not a Stalinist monument, of course, it's 1982, from the celebrations of 1500's alleged anniversary of the city, was also a perfect Soviet monument at the time. It was probably imagined, as far as I remember, as far as I can recall, as a monument related to the notion of Kievan Rus as the cradle of three fraternal peoples, Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian. But it was immediately reimagined by the newlyweds, who, instead of going to some ideological monument, actually wanted to go there and leave the flowers at this one. Actually, I think this is what we wanted to do as well at our wedding in 1987, but the car broke in the middle of Khreshchatyk, so we never made it there. But it was a kind of a place accepted by people. It was a monument which didn't carry a heavy ideological load, and the one which was easy to imagine and accept. Now, so the Soviet monuments then come in different varieties, and it's only a certain type of Soviet monuments that would be attacked for ideological reasons. But let us look at this particular most ideological, most political type of the monuments, marking important historical places and important social places in Kyiv. So Lenin was constructed in 1946 using the existing sculpture by prominent sculptor Merkurov. Very interesting looking, actually laconic and at the same time in the movement, but rather small. And if it were not for a high pedestal, Lenin would not make a major impression there. But Kyiv was a very interesting place after the war. It was lacking a permanent monument to Stalin. Interestingly enough, what you see in this picture is a temporary monument to Stalin constructed from non-durable materials, which would not survive more than several years. It was in fact built in the late 1940s and quickly removed by the 1950s. The location was the same as the original monument to Stalin, in the exact place where Alexander II once stood, next to the Philharmonic building and the entrance to the park. So you see that part of the city used to be politically marked. The side of the European square, which is closest to the Dnieper, it used to be the space of politics because of the monument to Alexander II, subsequently the monument to Stalin, the permanent one, and after the war, a temporary monument to Stalin. But of course, by the time of Stalin's death, they were missing. None of them were standing. There was no point of applying the official mourning emotions. There was no other place where to cry for good loyalists. And so the Kyivans were photographed during Stalin's funeral facing this part of the park, but not actually any representation of Stalin as such. And it was never reconstructed. There's actually a very interesting debate about why. Khrushchev claimed because Khrushchev was so anti-Stalinist, but there are other explanations as well. Monuments were really expensive, had to be approved by the Soviet Union government, and the priority was actually very often Lenin rather than Stalin, interestingly enough, in the post-war period. Now let's look at the 1977 monument, which is very often referred in literature about Kyiv as the main Lenin monument. But of course, it was not the official name. That was the monument of the October Revolution, the one constructed on Maidan Nezalezhnosti, in the upper part leading to the hotel back then known as Moskva and now the Hotel Ukraina. That's a natural dominating point of the Maidan, and it was understood very well since the reconstruction of the Maidan. And I'm actually in the process of writing the book about the history of the Maidan as architectural space, celebration space, and protest space, and also execution space at some point. That this natural dominating point of the square was always understood this way. Before the monument was constructed, there were usually huge portraits of Lenin and at some point Stalin, and banners installed at that very location, because it was very clear that this is the dominating point of the cityscape, of the main square potentially. So when it was built, the authorities actually adjusted for scale because they knew exactly what design they wanted, but they also wanted to understand how it would look if it is slightly larger or slightly smaller. So it was adjusted at the last moment for scale to make it larger so it would visually dominate the square more prominently. And as I said, this is the moment when the parades start going in the opposite direction, because the Lenin statue, the new one, the October Revolution, now has to be on the right. And the government reviewing stand would also be on the right. And I think this is where it still is actually on many occasions. So that meant the parades are going the opposite direction, but that also meant that the original Lenin, the Merkurov Lenin, is no longer relevant. He's just facing the Bessarabka, and it's quite unclear what he is in fact doing there. Now, with the construction of the new monument of the October Revolution, Maidan was confirmed as the main political space of the entire republic. This is, in fact, the reason why students would show up in 1990 for the revolution of granite to protest there. And it is then the reason why 2 more revolutions would take place in the same space when the statue was no longer be there, because the monument would be removed as well with the collapse of communism. And it's interesting actually to consider that with the collapse of communism, even before the end of the Soviet state, the October Revolution monument is already deconstructed, both symbolically and physically. But the smaller Lenin statue by Merkurov is allowed to stay. Why would that be? The answer most likely is that the central political space at the time is understood already as Maidan. The issue is the domination of Maidan, whereas the other Lenin, relatively forgotten, can stand at the other end of Khreshchatyk. Now, of course, there are plenty of Soviet monuments still standing in the city, and very prominent are the monuments commemorating the Soviet version of the Great Patriotic War. What I wanted to do today, however, was to look at the differences among these monuments. Not all of them represent the same version of the Great Patriotic War. We sometimes assume that there is a coherent Soviet version of the Great Patriotic War, but of course it changed, and the holiday itself was a working day until 1965, except for only 2 years after the war. And our vision of what it is actually the vision we encountered during the late Brezhnev period, those who remember this period. But if you look back into the history of commemoration, it's actually very interesting. There was spontaneous commemoration taking place with the grave of Sholodenko, which was originally near Maidan. But then the Stalinist officialdom received a proper war hero when General Vatutin died after being wounded by the Ukrainian nationalist guerrillas. And the monument to Vatutin, 1948, is actually representing something fairly interesting. The Stalinist model of commemorating the war, because of the model of history existing at the time. The monument commemorates a general who can be called Stalin's pupil, a person working closely with Stalin, but not a soldier. Now, one problem with this monument from the point of view of present-day Ukraine is that it is the actual grave, which is exempt from any legislation about Soviet monuments. However, some Soviet symbolics was removed from the grave and the monument itself. And there are constant discussions about actually moving the grave as well, especially because the family apparently is in agreement. But when we look at the second one from the late 1950s, the park of the so-called Eternal Glory, constructed in the former Anosov Garden, not too far from the Vatutin Monument. And actually, the location of the Vatutin Monument is quite interesting too. It is very close to the parliament, but of course, for the people who selected the location, they didn't think in terms of the Verkhovna Rada building. They thought in the terms of this being the location of the Church of Saint Alexander Nevsky, which was the parochial church of Pechersk, of the Lipki district, the most important church there, which is deconstructed in the 1930s. But of course, the people who decide on where to bury Vatutin, they know that this used to be the location of the church, interestingly enough, right? So it misplaces, replaces a very different building, but the structure which is connected to memory and spirituality as well. Now, when we think about the Khrushchev period, it's very often missing in the discussions of the Great Patriotic War because the Brezhnev period is important. But actually, the attempt to construct the Eternal Glory Park was a major transformation. It was not intended as a monument to a general or a great leader, but rather it incorporated straight away something very Western, borrowed straight from the West, maybe not so straight. I actually have an article in preparation about that. Not so straight because it looks like Khrushchev's foreign trips in the 1950s featured several monuments to the unknown soldier in different countries. There's every reason to believe that he was influenced by what he saw there. And I looked into the documents of the architects designing the park. They were actually discussing examples from Belgium and from elsewhere in Europe. They knew. Some of them traveled, others saw photographs. It was borrowed straight from the West and converted into a very Soviet cult of the unknown soldier. So if you look at it, the way it is arranged, there are some graves of prominent generals moved there, but the ultimate central point of the park and the monument is in fact a stela, which commemorates the unknown soldier. So if you think of it in terms of de-Stalinization, that would actually be a transition from the great military leader to recognizing, to some degree, the sacrifice of the people. That would be actually an important development. But that would also be the reason why it would have to be undone under Brezhnev in the early 1980s. This is precisely the reason why the colossal motherland statue would be erected further south and complete with a museum of the Great Patriotic War. The official argument at the time of why it was needed actually emphasized the importance of the museum, the importance of education, of the Soviet memory of the war. But you would realize right away that the difference here is that the Eternal Glory Park commemorates the sacrifice and the victims, whereas the new monument celebrated the achievements of the state and the Communist Party. It was not intended for intimate ceremonies like laying flowers. There is an eternal flame there, but it is huge. It's impossible to approach. It's impossible to lay flowers next to it. It is really, the entire square is designed for massive celebrations, but not too many massive celebrations took place, of course, because the Soviet Union soon disintegrated. After the Soviet collapse, there was an immediate reaction in terms of the aesthetics of monuments to the gigantic style of late socialism. What is really interesting is that some of these monuments modified the existing memorial places. The two best examples in Kyiv are actually the monument to the Ukrainian actor Leonid Bykov, who is portrayed in the character of a military pilot from a very popular film. So this tiny monument attached to the kind of border zone of the Eternal Glory Park transformed the entire park, because it became enormously runaway success, and my favorite newlyweds, of course, are showing up there much, much more often than at the main stela of the unknown soldier. Why? It's human and humane. It is to scale. It's a kind of real size of a real person, and thus allows an intimate contact with what is being commemorated there. Interestingly enough, there was a monument of approximately the same type, slightly larger in scale, added to the border zone of the museum memorial complex of the Great Patriotic War, added really to the colossal statue of the motherland. As you walk down the steps towards the statue of the motherland Museum, on your left, there would be a monument to the fallen. This is what the inscription here says. I couldn't get a good photograph. To the fallen. When I was recording a television interview at the museum, I actually asked the people working there about this monument, and they said, oh, it's not ours. It's not on our balance. So we're not responsible for the upkeep and maintenance and everything. It was built by the Kyiv city administration in the 90s. And the Kyiv city administration, of course, was reacting to what they realized was a popular demand. Some kind of a return to commemorating the victims, as opposed to celebrating the victory of the Soviet state. But this aesthetic principle, of course, was wider than just modifying the existing memorial spaces. The new ones, in particular, the monument to the Afghan veterans constructed in Kyiv in the late 1990s, and shown here in the larger image, was also done in the same aesthetics. Of human size, possible to approach, possible to touch if you want, very easy to lay flowers. And this aesthetic principle is very prominent during the late 90s going into the early 2000s. But then it was undermined by something rather unpleasant, which I have to address. By the concept of park sculpture. Park sculpture, which is explicitly entertainment-oriented and anti-ideological in any sense, but in reality, reflecting the imperial Russian-speaking culture of the late Soviet period. This is a monument to Panikovsky, of course, a character from Ilf and Petrov's 12 Chairs, but plenty of them around every post-Soviet major town, and you would see in them subtly encoded notions of rejecting new memorial space, or rejecting perhaps the old one as well, but being left in some kind of a limbo. The refusal to accept a new serious commemoration and representation, but rather to make spaces which are good for fun. And that undermined the concept of more intimate, more humane sculpture to a significant degree. Now, let us look at two important memorial spaces in Kyiv. One is, of course, the Eternal Glory Park. As you see on this photograph, you see the stela of the unknown soldier, after it the candle of the Holodomor, and beyond the Lavra bell tower, which of course was architecturally the model to which both monuments were responding. So they were both built in dialogue with Lavra, and of course the candle also in dialogue with the stela of the unknown soldier. But what happened to the Park of Eternal Glory was the introduction of an equally large, an important monument which commemorated now Ukrainian genocide, a monument to which foreign delegations were now going. Most foreign dignitaries arriving in Kyiv actually pay a visit to that monument. It redefined the park, big time. It redefined the park as a place of commemorating something more specifically Ukrainian. It actually changed, if we think of it, it actually changed the meaning of the unknown soldier as well. The unknown soldier was also now part of a space marked specifically as Ukrainian tragedy. And also, the architects working on the candle realized that large monuments do not necessarily speak to a modern audience. And very shrewdly, they also introduced a monument of humanities there, the small statue to scale of a small girl, which is exactly now the place where the foreign dignitaries leave their flowers. So the intimate dimension was built into this complex, into this space from the very start, but the presence of the candle behind it and the tragic connotations of the image of the little girl did not allow to turn it into a kind of park sculpture, to look at it as an equivalent of Panikovsky. That was the way to salvage the concept of intimate, approachable sculpture. Now, the second memorial place here is Babyn Yar. And here as well, there is an official Soviet monument, which probably appears in one of my later slides. Not here, the official Soviet monument from the 1970s, which was repeatedly criticized, but it was still an important place even to express the oppositional views because of its anchoring in history. The Eternal Glory Park is not anchored in history at all. It was just a park, basically abandoned at the time. It's a new memorial place created specifically, and now, of course, embedded within the structures of commemoration in a very significant way. The Babyn Yar is opposite. It is so openly and strongly anchored in the landscape because of the events that took place there, that the issue is only to what degree any memorial structures and ceremonies would be able to reflect the tragic scale of these events. So, in addition to the Soviet monument, soon after independence, more specifically, Jewish monument to the tragedy was constructed, the one featuring the menorah, which is now also the principal space for foreign delegations visiting Kyiv. But that was not the only one. The park now features over 40 small monuments, each of them claiming one particular part of the Babyn Yar legacy in a variety of ways. Actually, one of the monuments also uses more than one, because several which represent people in a real scale, like a real size. But the one I wanted to use in this lecture is in fact the monument using the theme of broken toys and commemorating the children executed in Babyn Yar. It's actually also very touching, also very approachable, just like the small girl from the Holodomor monument. And this is the place where people would often leave flowers, not the official delegations. The location is not particularly convenient for those. But the legacy of the Babyn Yar is now claimed by a variety of groups and in a variety of ways: Jewish victims, Jewish fighters, now Ukrainian nationalists, all kinds of groups. Now the Orthodox priests executed, there are monuments basically all around the park. But what they did was to decenter the Soviet monument, to add meaning to it, but to add meaning to it in a variety of ways. So it's actually the opposite to the Eternal Glory Park, in which there was a very clear version of national memory which needed to be introduced. Now, in this case, there are multiple competing memories, and of course, the situation continues to be very interesting and fluid if you are observing what is happening with commemoration projects in Babyn Yar, and controversial too. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Soviet monuments that are no more. What happens to them? Now, after Lenin was removed, as we discussed earlier, right, the place didn't really have political meaning. There was not much memory of political celebrations before 1976, 1977 there, and the parade going in the opposite direction. Briefly, the Communist Party of Ukraine tried to make it a prominent place for celebrations, but it's not conveniently located for that. It's surrounded on all three sides by active streets with lots of traffic, so there is no space as such. Because of that, what happened with Lenin was the major art gallery sponsored by the oligarch Viktor Pinchuk is just across the street to the right. The Pinchuk Art Center, which is the leading Ukrainian institution for modern and postmodern art. And perhaps this connection became important because the postament from Lenin's statue became a place for various artistic projects. an enormously interesting place, I would add, somewhat similar to that location on Trafalgar Square in London, UK, where you would see the classical design of this square, neoclassical design of the square, being challenged by changing artistic projects in the same square. So Kyivans as well were puzzled by the variety of them. I'm not showing you all of them because there would be some nudity otherwise. All kinds of artistic representations were there. But they usually had a leading theme of imagining and reimagining the past, recovering humanities in us. One project proposed actually mounting the statue, going on top of it and imagining yourself as a monument. But that also elicited protest from certain quarters, and then Ukrainian patriotic groups apparently tried twice now to reclaim the monument by painting it in Ukrainian colors, building the trident sign on it, and positioning the flags of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian national flag on it. Now, that place is a work in progress, so it remains to be seen what happens there. But what is interesting, though, is that Lenin was replaced by emptiness, which kind of means that Lenin was empty as well, in a way. So he was not replaced by an immediate symbol on which everybody would agree. In that part of Ukraine, there was apparently no such symbol on which everybody would agree. In fact, municipal authorities tried to initiate discussions of what would be there. The proposals would be very radical, including Virgin Mary and such, but there was no agreement at all. Now, you would ask, what happened to this most important and dominating political space of the capital, the space of the former October Revolution monument at the other end of Khreshchatyk? And the answer is a shopping mall, the symbol of capitalism, is in the exact same space where Lenin and revolutionary workers once stood, and sailors, I think, but somewhat closer to the Maidan and facing in the exact same direction. Actually, when I do finish that book, it will explain why that particular direction, because on the other side, there used to be a prominent political center for local politics, the city municipal hall. Now there is a column of independence constructed, I think, in 2001, which, when it was unveiled, elicited a number of protests in the city. It was not immediately accepted by Kyivans, not because of Ukrainian independence at all, but because of what was seen as an uninspiring and tacky design of it. There are so many similar monuments around the world. The architects argued back that the neo-Baroque design of the foundation in particular was a reference to the Ukrainian Cossack Baroque. But it took time to accept this monument, and I think we could argue with significant justification that it was really fully accepted after the Maidan, especially after the Revolution of Dignity, because the fighting was around this column. And now when bodies of Ukrainians killed in the war with Russia are brought back to the capital, the coffins actually did become accepted now, whereas at the time it was seen as representing the corruption of Kuchma administration and the tacky style of Kuchma and Kyivan authorities. So there is a replacement in the main political space, but not in the space of the second Lenin monument. Now, very quickly here, what about the other ones? A fascinating case of Mykola Shores, which is also the work of art which is protected because of that, but what people often miss in this controversy is that Shores is not a real historical figure here. There was a real historical Shores who in fact passed through that very point a number of times. There is a film. But the Shores that we knew as a construction produced by the great Ukrainian film director, Alexander Dovzhenko. It's basically a Stalinist myth of Shores. And the various efforts to remove this statue so far only led to two important and interesting developments. In this case, there is a clear replacement. So the patriotic circles demand that Shores be replaced with Konovalets, Yevhen Konovalets, who, come to think of it, is a near equivalent of Shores, except on the Ukrainian side. a junior officer of World War I who became an important revolutionary leader with the Ukrainian Revolution. That's almost the same as Shores. So an attempts, of course, to remove it and replace it only led so far to renaming the Shores Street in Kyiv to Konovalet Street, and numerous graffiti on the monument renaming it symbolically as the Konovalets Monument. Then one leg of the horse was removed, and we are still trying to figure out whether it was political protest or trying to make some money selling bronze for scrap. And at some point it was also covered in Ukrainian national colors, as you see in this image, which is basically one way of papering it over and kind of hiding it from view. Now, the second example from a different part of town is actually even more fascinating. It's a monument originally it's a monument to the two traitors, the Iskra and Kochubey, the ones who betrayed Hetman Ivan Mazepa to Peter the Great. But that was replaced in 1923 with a monument to the revolutionary workers of Arsenal, a major Soviet mythology of the Ukrainian Revolution, the rebellion at the Arsenal plant. The Arsenal is right across the street. And the wall you would see is the one still damaged by gunfire and machine gun fire as well. So when the monument was unveiled in 1923, nobody bothered to correct the fact that the foundation was too big proportionately for the actual item on top of it, which is a mountain gun, actually a French mountain gun from World War I, which was allegedly in this version used by the revolutionary defenders to protect Arsenal against the Ukrainian nationalistic troops. Numerous demands to do something about the monument only resulted in it being vandalized repeatedly and the Soviet symbols removed from it, until one day in 2019, the residents woke up to see a totally different inscription on this monument. It was now a monument not to the defenders of the Arsenal, but to the attackers, to the Ukrainian People's Republic Army, which was in fact attacking the Arsenal. The beauty of it, they didn't even have to move the gun, because the gun actually was facing the Arsenal building even before that. So what about symbolic plasticity in this case? My answer would be, interestingly enough, this fact has yet to be reflected in any social, cultural, or political ceremonies. Most people passing by the monument do not even know that it changed its meaning to the opposite. Moreover, this monument happens to be the gathering place of pro-Russian and communist activists when they march to Verkhovna Rada, the parliament, or when they march to the Eternal Glory Park. So if it is marked today by any political force, it is by the force which would still think it is the monument to the revolutionary workers, rather than to those who suppressed the rebellion. Now, let's see where I am. Oh, approaching the end. Okay, now one of most fascinating cases of how to transform a monument is actually the monument with fairly low plasticity, I have to say. Not only the Motherland statue was done in a late Brezhnevite aesthetics and basically laughed at ever since because of its design, not really accepted by Kyivans, but a subject of great many jokes, but also it's impossible to remove. And even apparently it would be extremely challenging to remove the Soviet coat of arms from the shield. So how to deal with it? The image on the right, as you see the poppies, the red poppies, and the Ukrainian colors of the Ukrainian flag as well. That was a very interesting initiative by a famous Ukrainian roofer, which was approved by the Ukrainian authorities as well, to reimagine it as celebrating a very different version of the war, the version of the war which carries the Western connotations of remembering the victims, celebrating the saviors, not those who killed most, but those who saved most. The other strategy, lighting, which would paint it in the colors of the Ukrainian flag. And if you look real closely at the central image, also project the Ukrainian trident on top of the Soviet coat of arms on the shield. And finally now, the project is completed this year, the construction of a flagpole with the highest national flag in all of Ukraine, which serves as an important reference point. You would remember Lavra, the monument to the unknown soldier, the candle of the Holodomor, and now the highest flagpole with the Ukrainian flag, which basically transformed this space. But what is the real important transformation is that the museum reimagined itself, or rather it is in the process of reimagining itself. And for the public, going to inside museum and inside the statue, if you sit there for some time, as I had when the television interview was being recorded and re-recorded and whatever, you would realize that most people actually go there in order to observe the statue from inside as a technical project, and ideally to get at the observation point high up there. It's known as a place of extreme tourism. That's how it is advertised, extremalny tourism. So it is more of a technical curiosity for these people than an actual Soviet monument. And the museum, of course, no longer projects the Soviet version. Moreover, the museum now is reimagining itself as also representing the war with Russia, the current war with Russia. So then the sacred meaning embedded in this, the sacred symbolic meaning embedded in this statue in the 1980s is nearly gone. Now, regardless of the fact that there is still a coat of arms and still the design is very Soviet. And by the way, the cover of my most recent book in Ukrainian actually uses the puppy design as well. And this is a book about the war and the ways to think about the war and its memory. And my very last slide is, of course, of a very interesting place. Now, this late Soviet monument as well, another one constructed to celebrate the 1500th anniversary of Kyiv, was built in a place with a pre-existing cultural and social tradition. It was built in the place of an observation point over the Dnieper, one of the best observation points. And also in a place which was marked by the tradition of musical evenings and orchestra playing in the garden. If you go deeper in the 19th century, you would also get dancing and theater companies, the so-called merchant's garden. That's what it is. And interestingly enough, the tradition continued in Soviet times. So that was an attempt to reclaim the place, which was firmly associated with entertainment and family walks on weekends, and turn it into a political place. And it didn't work. Didn't work in part because there wasn't too much time left of the Soviet Union, but also because the Kyivans continued to actually go beyond the monument to the observation point. And what happened to it in independent Ukraine? Apparently, the people interpreting the decommunization legislation argued that there's only one piece there, which needs to be decommunized. And this is the Soviet medal kept by the two workers, the Russian and Ukrainian worker. The rest of the monument doesn't carry any explicit Soviet symbolism, but of course it carries a very clearly understood symbolism of unity, and it was known popularly as yoke, the Russian yoke imposed on Ukraine as well. So what happened to it now? Well, the exact same thing as for more than a century before its construction. People just go beyond it to various entertainment venues. There was a small amusement park built right after it, closer to observation point. And for much of the 90s, it was primarily an amusement park. And now, of course, there is a new bridge there, named after the mayor of Kyiv, the Klitschko Bridge informally. But what then happens is that people don't go to this monument at all. They go to the bridge. They pass under the construction and actually head elsewhere. And that road, the bridge, leads them to the monument of Saint Vladimir, the Imperial Russian monument reimagined as a symbol of Kyiv. Now, the clashing meanings here are too much for me to interpret. I would really need to see some field work done about how people now even understand this memorial place. What is clear enough is that the Soviet authorities wanted to build the Arch of Friendship as an answer to Saint Volodymyr dominating the opposite hill, just opposite. But now when they are connected, what does it make exactly of this space? Is there any political meaning left at all? Was there any political meaning to start with in the arch? And as you see, this photograph portrays the arch at the time when it was a site of an artistic project. of sympathy with the hostages held in Russian prisons. So the arch of friendship is cracking in this particular artistic project. So as you see then, the political meaning has to be established. It can be changed. There are various mechanisms for that, and it can also disappear to a significant degree, as is the case with the motherland statue and the arch as well. And here is where I'm going to stop.
Thank you so much for that amazing and really enlightening conversation. I think I'm just really blown away by the amount of observation it took to notice some of these differences. And you rightly point out that these are things that the average person might not notice or understand, even if they did notice it, which I think really is a fascinating aspect of this conversation. And what I have many questions. I will probably just ask one right now. But I want to know, what is it that makes monuments such a salient site for these political changes? And do you think that Ukraine is actually particular in the post-Soviet context in having monuments at the center of this discussion, or is this something that we can observe more widely in the post-Soviet space?
Well, the Soviet experience actually is one reason why the monuments are so prominent in discussion. But what is even more prominent there is that there was a change, a significant one. And that brings us to the comparison with the United States, for instance, right? So this whole story of removing or toppling statues is connected very clearly to a different view of history, which can no longer tolerate them, right? And in this sense, the American situation and the independence Ukrainian situation are similar in that there is present a version of history which is no longer acceptable for a variety of reasons. And it took some time in the Ukrainian case for this version to become completely unacceptable. And it's not true of all the urban centers in Ukraine. There are still statues that cause controversy, and especially the ones connected to Imperial Russia that would not be covered by the decommunization legislation as such. They are the ones that constitute the point of contention, and they're also the ones which are probably closer equivalent to the American story of, and British and elsewhere, of removing the monuments of the past, which for a time could be ignored or allowed for a regional version of national patriotism, but can no longer be accepted because of a different set of values existing as of now. Now, the Soviets were really big at marking political space. They went to it with guns blazing, really. They wanted to capture the most important places because they believed in transforming human nature. Which was, in the understanding of Soviet authorities, an emotional experience as well. So gigantic statues, impressive statues, reflected the Soviet aesthetics and Soviet ideology too. Ukraine also was a place which was fairly important to mark for the Soviets because it was conquered with great difficulty in 1919, 1920, recovered with great difficulty in the 1940s. And actually, I think I said at the start of this lecture that the Soviet state is basically broke after the war. It has no money. And the monuments are funded, larger monuments are funded from the old Union budget. You have to petition Moscow for permission for that particular monument and that particular design. And Moscow is not going to give you too much money also for these monuments. But there is one exception. The newly incorporated territories of Western Ukraine are the ones where funding goes in larger amounts for marking them as Soviet space. And that basically tells us why Ukraine is so important, why it is so overwhelmed with a variety of monuments, and why during the ruin really of the post-war years, there is a majestic monument in Chernivtsi, for instance. Right? And all kinds of places out there, because the Soviet version has to be represented visually and emotionally, and is understood as an emotional experience.
Thank you. I would be really curious, and I am assuming this is outside of the realm of what your focus is on Kyiv, but it would be obviously very interesting to compare the pace of change of memorial spaces, how change in different parts of Ukraine looks a little bit different. That's probably outside of the scope of your current project. But for
actually not necessarily.
Better.
As I said, it's a talk composed from several articles at different points of being prepared, and it's going to be a small book in Ukrainian. And one of the articles is actually about the most recent monuments, the monuments to the Heavenly Hundred and the Ukrainian heroes of the war, the current war. And what is actually happening there is that the local authorities and the local architects and the local communities are actually looking for a very different language, and specifically the language opposite to the Soviet language, rejecting the idea of a monument that would dominate in favor of the monument which would engage in most cases. So in this case, the first part of the monument unveiled in Lviv is very telling. It's very Western in design. It's actually a wall. And as you walk along the wall, you see the portraits of the heroes of the Heavenly Hundred. And that makes it at once abstract, leaving space for reflection, and very personal, because you engage with the real people and their real stories. And the same approach actually is in Kyiv, but of course the problem in Kyiv is that the construction of the memorial is currently blocked, and that of the museum as well, but the principle is the same. It's very modern, very abstract, and it is combined also. It is very modern and very abstract precisely because the portraits of the Heavenly Hundred are already present there. And they're present in the aesthetics understood as popular commemoration, more like the average grave marker in a cemetery in Ukraine. And that is actually, I think, very powerful language. It may appear to be uninteresting or even inappropriate or not sufficiently solemn. But the reality is that the Heavenly Hundred was first commemorated in a kind of tradition from below, how people would commemorate their family members. And now that this has been done, the next step to a larger monument prompts larger cities, at least, to think in very abstract and modernist terms. That is not the case elsewhere. Actually, one very interesting place for monuments is Vinnytsia. There are two monuments now to the Heavenly Hundred and the heroes of the Ato. One of them in the form of the tree representing the origins of the Heavenly Hundred. They came from different provinces and such. Flame often appears as symbol in monuments in other cities. And there is also the topic which is borrowed straight from the religious imagery, is that of angels. As you know, of course, the Heavenly Hundred were portrayed from the very start as angels. And that is holding, in part because I think it is also so it's basically a rejection of Soviet aesthetics together with Soviet ideology. And it has, for certain regions of Ukraine, the link to a tradition, especially in Western Ukraine. You would see the angels in the cemetery. So that language, even so it is seemingly opposite to the language of abstract modernism, walls and forms like that would be remindful of the West, nevertheless shares an important characteristic with it, namely, it is an explicit rejection of the Soviet tradition.
That's just great. I'm really looking forward to this book. We have an audience question that I think relates to that point that you just made from Hanna Protasova, who asks, do you think that the symbolic plasticity of monuments is connected more with political changes in Ukraine, or does it have something to do with the general social indifference toward the Ukrainian past among the wider public and with a lack of education in the field?
Right. Of course, it's also a factor. Of course it is. But actually, an interesting thing is that war monuments around the world tends to have high plasticity. So they are reimagined over and over again. In Riga, Latvia, there is, of course, a very large monument to the sharpshooters as representing the national tradition, which was not removed under the Soviets. It was kept because the same sharpshooters also represented the Soviet tradition. Many of them went on to fight in the Civil War on the Soviet side. But then during the interwar period, it was imagined as nationalistic one. The war monuments are powerful, and they tend to have relatively high plasticity, actually, unless they are marked in a very specific way and continue to be a subject of social practices. But yes, the Ukrainian situation is very fluid, enormously so. And it is very telling, by the way, that the Zelensky administration refuses to engage in any monumental propaganda whatsoever. It even refuses really to commit to larger projects that are already ongoing. They're not abandoned, but they're just not funded really, or funded just to the extent that would allow the existence of permanent staff and occasional exhibits. And this is because the Ukrainian situation is, unfortunately, was not properly addressed in the early to mid 1990s, when there was a good time to address the communist legacy. That did not happen because Kravchuk's term was too short and he was too busy with really important political matters. But Kuchma took the view, President Kuchma took the view that every region of Ukraine should be allowed to have its own heroes, even so these heroes could be opposite. So instead of trying to educate and undo the Soviet mythology, he allowed the existence of Soviet mythology now being converted into pro-Russian mythology in lots of regions. And that compartmentalization of memory then became a political issue. It became easy for politicians to mobilize people for it. Would be much more difficult to, promise to increase the pensions or whatever, but so much easier to promise to keep your Lenin monuments or your Soviet soldier monuments. And so we are actually facing a legacy which is fairly difficult to undo, but there is some progress, right? And the signs of progress that I would like to bring up here are two. One, under Yushchenko, the Holodomor became an important concept in national memory. Some people at the time were making fun of it, like Yushchenko did the same as the Soviet authorities. He sent a directive to every village that you must provide the list of whatever, but it worked. It worked. It actually became an important national tradition of lighting your candle, of the march of the Holodomor, ceremonies at the monument. And public opinion surveys now show that Ukraine is very different from Russia in this respect, that Stalin is no longer glorified in Ukraine, so it worked. But there's a second one, which I find also extremely promising, and that is the tradition of answering to the Victory Day, Putin style, with a day of remembrance and reconciliation, which involves the march of the veterans and family members of the killed veterans of this particular war with Russia. And that is a powerful answer because it translates what became enormously politicized into the everyday life of today. Because every family, every small town in Ukraine are going to have veterans, veteran organization, graves of the veterans as well. It's becoming an issue which is important for local identity as well. And the idea of creating the wall of photographs near St. Michael, along the wall of St. Michael Monastery was a powerful one. And lots of ceremonies have taken place there as well. And this I see as a sign that the Ukrainian society is making progress in accepting a new identity here. Not the one embroiled in this never-ending war with Russia about the past, but the one anchored in the present-day reality of fighting the Russian aggression. In the Ukrainian society of the present, regardless of whether people agree on the monuments of the past, they could be united around a very powerful symbol of the present, also because Russia has nothing to answer, because it does not recognize its involvement in the first place.
Great, thank you. We have I think we have time for both of these two questions that we have. We
also have a question in our chat as well, so we have 3 more questions.
Oh, super. I will read the one from the chat from Larissa Bilos, who says, what is the difference between the removal of the monument to Stolypin in 1917 and the removal of the Lenin monument in 2013?
That's not the same Lenin, right? So the monument in 2013 is actually the monument to the Soviet past writ large. It's a concept which does not necessarily have anything to do with ideology. It's more of rejecting the Soviet past in favor, decisively rejecting the Soviet past in favor of independent Ukraine. That's what is at stake. So Lenin is a very curious representation of this change. Could have been any other monument, but it became actually Lenin. And so, okay, let's go quickly through the other questions.
Yeah, oh, my apologies. There's also a question from Professor Hiroaki Kuromiya. Thank you for your interesting lecture. I'm not familiar with the recent monuments in Kyiv, but I wonder if a Bandera monument has appeared in Kyiv. If not, will one appear?
No. The answer is no. Interestingly enough, no monument to Mazepa so far in the capital, and even more interesting, no monument to Petlura. And that would take me into a direction which I would need 1 hour to explain what is happening with. Bandera is, of course, a regional hero, as my colleague Serhy Yekelchyk argues in his talks about Bandera. Now, Mazepa's case is more interesting because he is really, in a sense, associated with Kyiv's own past, and Yushchenko did have a plan to build the Mazepa monument just opposite the Eternal Glory Park, but it was not implemented. And now, of course, Petlura, the revolutionary leader, has no monument in Kyiv, but most recently, I think 2 weeks ago, a monument to Bolbochan was opened, kind of the person who rebelled against Petlura, who is now seen as a representation of more consistently Ukrainian nationalistic trend in the revolution as that of Petlura, who was too much of undecisive socialist for some present day radicals. So there is no decisive rewriting and there is no clear change. As I said, the monument to the postament to the Lenin monument remains empty and an open space for potentially projects or replacement, but there is no clear replacement as of now. And this is the Kyiv situation. The situation in Western Ukraine is, of course, different. You would have lots of banderas. There are sometimes banderas in the exact same space where Lenin once stood. But that too is not really the historic bandera, right? It's a symbol, just like Lenin is a symbol of something in late Soviet times and today a symbol of something else. Bandera too is an answer, like the extreme anti-Russian representation of Ukrainian history. This is what Bandera is. This is what he stands for. Not really for his rather complex ideological situation among Ukrainian patriots of various tribes during the war. So it would not be a comment, for instance, on Bandera's refusal to accept collective leadership within the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, because the people who come to the monument and bring flowers, they would not know much really about the internal struggles within the organization and the pressure to adopt more democratic, to actually start using the term democracy, really, right? And adopt collective leadership. So Bandera stands for the kind of the extreme anti-Russian version of history, but not for the real Bandera.
Yeah. Natalia, did you want to jump in?
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Emily. Thank you.
So I'll read the question from Joanna Nizinska, who asks, or who says, I like your parallel between the fate of the monuments in Ukraine and the debate in the US on toxic monuments. I've also been kind of thinking about these in parallel as well. I think it's, and people have been writing a lot about this, which has been really interesting. So she says, the US has recently been witnessing a rare public debate on the shape of the country's collective memory. And she's wondering about the modes in which Ukrainians debate their and not their monuments. What's the language of these debates and what are the venues for the debates?
Yeah, the Ukrainian context is different, I have to say. There's a very interesting theory that every monument contains within itself the suppressed representation, which is the opposite to the representation actually projected by the monument and the social events around the monument. But if this is true, then we would have to acknowledge that, as I said, Lenin is empty, and the postament is empty as well, because there is no clear one opposite representation embedded in Lenin. It has yet to be decided. And this is really what defines the Ukrainian situation. The debate is not really about what should be in Lenin's place, but whether there should be anything at all. And the line taken by President Zelensky, who received overwhelming support when he was elected, this is no longer the case apparently, but his line was that, does it even matter what kind of monument stands there? If you're feeling good about yourself and you're working to meet with your friends and such, that was really a funny argument. But essentially the one for, if the standard of life is high enough, would you even care? Right? That was the argument. So the Ukrainian debate is actually along the lines of whether we need a new version, which would be ideologically as pronounced as the Soviet version was. And if we do, what it would be. But it's not actually the process of selection there. But actually, I have to say that it could be the same in the United States. If you look carefully, right, it's about the removal of statues. It's not really about the replacement of statues too. And that tells me that in the West, this debate is also going to happen at some future point. Of course, what is playing into the hands of democratic voices and progressive voices in the West is that there is a pre-existing tradition on which to rely. There's the Arlington Memorial in the United States, right? When the wall was originally constructed by a very young female Asian architect, which was in itself a statement, right? It was seen by many as inappropriate. It's not the proper way to imagine the sacrifices, and it's not accidental, of course, that in the long run, more figurative statues were added to Arlington so that the wall would not be seen as just a wall and a kind of depressing objective representation of what the Vietnam War really was. But that tradition has already existed. And also in Europe, Europe is different in that Europe has plenty of Holocaust memorials, which are using very abstract language sometimes. They're modernist, very interesting ones, but also they worked through the issue of what it is to represent a tragedy, a sacrifice, or a heroic deed. They worked through this tradition, and there is something to rely upon. And there is something in the United States to rely upon as well, whereas in Ukraine, the first really modern monuments, the monuments which are abstract, which leave space for reflection, are only being constructed now, like last year really, the first one. The Soviets had no concept of an abstract monument. The Soviets actually had a very funny concept of a huge head. So in order to represent an idea, they would construct a colossal head of Lenin or Marx. They even constructed a colossal head of Marx as a gift to Germany. It's still standing in Germany, actually. Huge head. But that's like as naive as it gets, really. So in order to represent the idea, there has to be a huge brain and huge head. But they did not allow the abstract language in most cases. And so there is no public perception which would open space for the possibilities represented by the abstract and modernist monuments. Whereas in the West, it is existing, so that the figurative traditional 19th century statues or early 20th century statues in the South are not only rejected in terms of what they stand for, but also in terms of aesthetic design. The replacements, if they're ever built in exact same spaces, which I kind of doubt, would be very different, right? So they are likely to be, again, abstract walls or plaques, or maybe perhaps steps. So it's a different language which is open to the West, and it's an advantage for the West.
Serhy, I will allow one more question for myself. So I was really, it was really fascinating to see how places can be redefined or reimagined. And you specifically pointed out that there are some memorials or some monuments or some parks to which international delegations are brought. And I was really fascinated by this comment that you made that not all the places, not all the parks are convenient enough for international delegations to visit. But I thought that it's also a very specific way to redefine the memorial space, not only of the city, not only of the community, but of the whole country as well. So along those lines, I'm also thinking about the local response to monuments. As you pointed out while you were showing your final slides with the Arch of Friendship, it would probably take another hour to explain all those clashing narratives that the arch represents. But Kyiv seems to embody this kind of resilience and this kind of resistance towards those narratives which were imposed as well. Yes, some narratives were absorbed probably, and some narratives were appropriated, but some narratives were very much resisted. So I'm wondering about the response of Kyiv residents to all these monuments, and to probably the removal of the monuments as well, because as your presentation also showed, not all monuments were removed with much protest.
Precisely. Yeah, that's also a big question, of course, but I would just refer to the very modern and very new way of commemorating the Heavenly Hundred by the searchlights pointed upwards, which originally was intended as a projection of the souls of them as angels flying up, but it became actually enormously popular in Kyiv. And it is such a stunningly innovative way that it's not really truly attached to anything on the ground, but it became popular also because it provides a larger equivalent of a candle. And the tradition of the candle is very much present there. So when you see people showing up in large numbers with candles, you know that this is going to work. And I don't think people actually immediately reject and destroy right away a monument. It's more like they are switching to a different monument and a different tradition and a different mode of commemoration, whereas the other monument becomes abandoned or reimagined in an interesting place. Right, and there are monuments in Kyiv. For instance, in Holosievsky Park, there is actually a soldier living for war, but it's not just a Soviet soldier. It's a student of a local university who volunteered to fight with the Nazis, and this is a Soviet monument, but it's also local. And there are students there who go there, and there are local ceremonies by these universities that commemorate those who fell in the war. So they changed it. They put glory to all defenders of Ukraine on a large stela leading to the monument, and became reimagined in a major way. The Eternal Glory Park, there is now a petition in progress, I think, about redoing the entrance to the park to make the dates of the war 1939, 1945, instead of the Soviet version 1941, 1945. So what would that do? It's not the immediate rejection, but it's an attempt to reimagine, to shift priorities. I think some monuments in the long run are going to be abandoned. And that perhaps is a very powerful way of rejection.
Thank you so much, Serhy. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture, and thank you for guiding us through the memorial space of Kyiv, which seemed to be marked with this fascinating plasticity. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Emily, for helping moderate.
Thank you so much for sharing this really, really important topic, and I'm sure we'll all be looking forward to the publications that come out of it.
Keep reminding me. I need reminders. Yeah.
Thank you, Emily, for moderating the lecture. And thank you, Annie, for your continuous technical support as well.
Yeah, and thank you, Natalia, for being the force behind this show. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Today, Dr. Serhy Yekelchyk presented his talk, Transforming Kyiv's Memorial Space. Thank you for attending our lecture today, and please join us this Thursday. We will have another lecture. Information about upcoming events will be posted on the UkrSO listserv and on our Facebook page, Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. You can view previous lectures and talks on our YouTube channel, and for future events that we will post, please subscribe to our channel.